Hey, can you hear me okay?
Hello. Yeah, good. Sounds great. For
Grab
once,
some-
Linux worked. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Let's just go ahead and jump into it. So Kevin had volunteered to be the scribe for today. Is there any volunteers for next one? It's a pretty high pressure, high stress position. So, be careful volunteering. Anyone?
I'll take it next time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. Cool. And I guess that is really it here. I guess it looks like according to the agenda, the results from our doodle was in, and basically the meeting time will stay the same, at least for the time being. We may have to slightly adjust it to support other time zones periodically, but I think overall we'll just stay with the same schedule. So hopefully people are good with that. And then it looks like Oleg has the first agenda topic.
Maybe I put it last time. Okay.
It was for the governance stuff.
Yeah, so basically my question to the team 2 weeks ago was whether we are ready to proceed with the governing board, and we discussed a few options synchronously. Several people stepped up. So basically I wanted to proceed on this topic and at least start defining board members so that we can have operating governance model. We haven't been yet reviewed by the CNCF, but this part would be quite important for the review even on the sandbox stage. So thanks to everyone who responded. So basically, yeah, I'll just open the meeting notes and put my proposal there in terms of names, those stepped up. And again, nothing is really slated in the stone. So right now it's just a conversation, and we can either agree or not on names and nominations and self-nominations. But yeah, I think that we could at least start it so that we have more people on board. So just a second, I'll find my list, which is somewhere in Slack, I guess. Yeah, and also one related topic, I submitted my proposal for the technical steering committee. So basically it's rather nominal role in the current definition about facilitating things, reviewing things, but still the feedback would be appreciated if you want to move forward with this steering committee. Okay, so I have access to the document. And yeah, basically what I wanted to propose is that maybe I could just share later. But yeah. So for the governance, the proposal we had is, so once we discussed that, just a second, I'll screen share. Sorry, it took me some time to catch up with all my windows. Okay, this is my screen. Okay, so this is a proposal which we tentatively agreed on last time we met. So basically, I guess Michael and Pete said that they would be interested, right? So what we have, so we have one slot which is currently open. So people we talked to basically raised the question whether the diversity of the board should be considered, but right now we don't have the 7th member identified. So if somebody wants to step up, it's a good opportunity.
Maybe one comment from my side. I think we should only
Yeah.
have like one person from Dynatrace in there. So if it's between Michael and me, I would volunteer for the time being, because we want to like really everybody be properly represented here. And an equal representation of like vendors, implementers, and end users would at least be ideal. So we have Justin in there, obviously. We have Peter in there.
So yeah, basically chat allows multiple representatives from one company, as long as it's lesser than 50%. But yeah, we can limit to one member from any company right in this park. I see no problem with it. So basically, if you and Michael agree, then it could be just one of you.
Yeah, I'd rather open that seat to somebody else in here.
So, Michael, fine with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Which Michael?
Oh, Mike Beamer.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so basically it leaves us with 2 slots, but we can proceed even with 5 members now, so that we initialize, and then we have a few more weeks to find the remaining 2. Maybe based on the new companies and interested parties who join, but at least with 5 members, the board can already operate according to the charter. So yeah, as long as it's odd number, it should be fine. Okay, and for technical steering, so basically what we discussed, so just to have a group of 3 contributors. There is a proposal submitted in the pull request. So basically membership in the technical steering committee doesn't give any special permissions. Instead of that, it basically, well, basically it's a formal role that says that yeah, you facilitate all kinds of decision making for specification, for other technical parts. And yeah, of course, yeah, it's a public role, but at the same time, it doesn't strictly get any permissions because the decision making happens according to the documented process. So through the same consensus of contributors. And yeah, the question to the team is whether we want to have it. So one of the reasons to introduce this role was firstly to follow the patterns of other projects. So OpenTelemetry has technical steering committee and many other incubated projects. Also, it allows to have more people on board in terms of official roles. So it's one of the opportunities to actually have more interested parties and end users, company contributors to be represented in the project officially. So the idea was to just start from 3 people, but we can also grow. And the proposal on the table I have is basically Todd, Steve Arch from CloudBees, and Dan O'Brien. So basically it adds 2 more companies to the governance model. Question to the team, does it make sense? And if so, are you fine with these nominations, or would you like to grow to 5 people, consider other people?
What's if we like, is this like a point in time where we have to lock it and then we can't add more people, or can we just say we're fine with it for now and add more people if we find more people?
So we can add more people. I think everything right now is a moving target. So for the governing board, there is expectation set that the board will be converted to fully elected body within 2 years, with half of the board being re-elected next year. So basically, we start from Bootstrap, identified by interested parties we have at the moment, basically people on the call and who participate synchronously. Then we start with formal elections. And for technical steering committee, it's basically the same. So we have 3 people bootstrapped, then they can step down at any moment. We can grow it to 5 if needed. And yeah, later, within 1 year, we will still reappoint them.
Yeah, I think starting with 3 for the time being might be fine. And also, like as we evolve, like language SDKs and others, new people might come on board. Yeah, and to Pete's point, we can easily like elect somebody else. Right now, it's just a more bootstrapping type of approach, because as you usually want to have people being at least in maintainer status or have a number of significant contributions available, that like right now obviously falls under the table, because how would this work in a bootstrapping mode?
So while we're on Bootstrap, everything is a kind of moving target. But yeah, I think it's important to start early, so that again, since CF will ask about that, we can actually, we already have a lot of changes coming in the specification, so people who are more or less responsible to coordinate reviews and decision making would be really important in the current stage, just to make sure that nothing is stuck. And yeah, I think that it would be nice to initiate that. Okay, so if everyone fine, yeah, my question regarding the names, are we fine with this Bootstrap governing board? So I guess everyone explicitly declared interest or confirmed. So if you're fine, we can proceed with this body. And for the next 2 seats, again, we have then a few more weeks to make nominations, to talk to people.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I think leaving a couple open makes sense. If someone wants to throw their, get involved, there's certainly opportunities then. So I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that one thing was mentioned in the asynchronous meeting was, as much as possible, let's try to emphasize diversity, not just of like a company you're coming from, but also of identity. So let's try and do what we can there. It's not always an easy target, but
yeah, I think this might actually get better as soon as the project has more traction. I mean, right now, it's like creating massive diversity amongst the team here is a bit hard, as Oleg pointed out, but this is hopefully also going to change as we see more project and more momentum on the project.
Yes. So then I think we can agree on this list. So I can basically next step, I can just put it to the chat as official proposal. Maybe give it a timeout, something like a few days until we have consensus in the chat. And basically, if we have consensus there, then the decision is made. And we will just put the dates so that we have a baseline.
Should we rather put it into an issue, or like, because then people also can say that they like agree and we have it more formally documented, just and link people there.
Okay, so basically a GitHub issue with +1 or -1 votes.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
To
then we have also like there's agreement amongst the initial team.
Okay, I will do that tonight. Okay, then we can proceed with that. And thanks to everyone who stepped up and to everyone who shared the feedback, because it's important milestone and happy to move it forward.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for help driving that. Todd, it looks like you're up next. You ready?
yeah, I am. Okay, so before I share my screen, what I'll be sharing is kind of a moving as quickly as I can through a lot of the most recent research that took place in the SDK research demo repository. So as you guys know, this is not official code, but it has been really useful in elucidating all the parts of the API that need to be defined in terms of what we want application authors to be able to do, but also the integration points across various vendors. So I'm going to be kind of going through the latest iteration of the interfaces and the APIs. Most of this is reflected in a pull request that I have linked in the document, and then I'll finish up with a quick demo. So I'm going to be moving pretty fast. Feel free to stop me if you have a question. But again, pretty much all of this is documented and also available in a pull request. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so yeah, first thing is we added a few things to the README. So a lot more information on the demos that have gotten out of date, but also this application author API. So if you check out the glossary, again, the application author is a feature flag user in the sense that they're mostly writing application code, and they're concerned with what Justin has referred to as pivot points in their application logic, which I think is a great way to talk about feature flags. So yeah, they're not really concerned about the backing system, the feature flag control plane. They don't really care about how these feature flags are evaluated. So this is the API that's most important to them, the part of the API and the SDK that's most important to them. So I just have a quick overview here. You can see, going from the very basic Boolean flag evaluation to more complicated scenarios. So take a look at this if you haven't yet. It's a fairly decent overview of the current state. So the next thing to move on to, we did have some changes in our provider interface. So this is the interface that feature flag providers, feature flag vendors, feature flag services of any kind need to conform to be able to provide the feature flag evaluation data to the application author. So the biggest change we made recently is that the evaluations you have to implement are now a little bit richer. So instead of just returning a flag value, they return a more complex wrapper object, the provider evaluation interface. Now, obviously the value is provided, but there's some additional metadata, and this is really useful for understanding why feature flag evaluation proceeded in the way it did. So again, there's error codes. If there was an error, there's a reason, and we're working on the semantics around reason. We may not actually want to define any semantics for reason within OpenFeature, and instead just pass on whatever the underlying provider exposes. We may want to do some mapping between a well-defined set of reasons in OpenFeature and then map those to provider reasoning. This data is not provided by every single provider. So it's kind of best effort whether or not this is defined in every single call. Again, keep in mind that when the application author is actually evaluating flags, they don't have to concern themselves with this information. So they can just do a basic call to get the value of a flag. But if they are interested in seeing more details, they can call a more advanced, a more detailed method to get a lot of these additional reasons, error codes, etc. It's a little bit more of an advanced use case. And like I said, again, provider to provider, this data may not all be available. And hopefully we can move towards more enriched data from all providers as we move into the future of OpenFeature and ideally better vendor support. So the next thing I think to talk about really quick is we do have a new provider we added. There's two versions of Flagsmith, the Flagsmith Provider. One thing that's relevant here, I guess I could go back to the provider implementation too that I was just mentioning. In addition to these more rich methods, we also introduced the concept of a context transformer. So a context transformer basically right now is a means to adapt the arbitrary attributes that OpenFeature exposes in flag evaluation in a way that the provider understands. So the provider can define this itself in its provider implementation, or it can actually accept this from the integrator who sets up the provider and they can do their own custom context transformation. But this would say map attributes like a user's IP address, a user's user identifier, to attributes that are maybe rigorously defined in the provider. Some providers have definitions and fields for these things that are well understood. For example, Launch Darkly has some predefined attributes like IP address, email address. So that mapping takes place here. It also, in the case of Flagsmith, for instance, there's some side effects that actually take place. So when the context is transformed in the context of Flagsmith, traits are set on the user object that is cached in the Flagsmith SDK. So that's a detail, that's an implementation detail from Flagsmith. But I think what I wanted to highlight here is we do have this kind of nice concept now around a well-defined way of transforming the arbitrary user attributes that come into feature flags to the user attributes that flag providers might be interested in a way that's kind of well defined and can be controlled both by the provider implementer and even the feature flag user if they want more specificity. So again, this is all available. Go ahead.
Is the thinking there just like, so I understand it, is the thinking here mainly essentially to make it easier for those flag provider implementers to just give them like here's like a standard pattern for implementing a provider, or is it more for the application? Oh gosh, I can't remember the glossary now, but like the person who's setting up, not the author, but person who's like works at the company that's using the thing. There's not
the integrator, I think, is what we
integrator is probably the name I came up with. I guess I'm just wondering, like because I'm thinking like in general with the first version of this thing is like there's this like line that we're walking between trying to make it rich and complete versus not kind of like guessing at things that we think will be useful, but we don't really know until people kind of start building it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the thing that you're hitting on is that we definitely want to strike a balance between complexity and power. So the context transformer is not something that needs to be supplied by the application integrator at all. They can completely ignore it. So it's optional. Where it's not optional is for the provider implementer. That is where it must be done. And the reason is evaluating traits on as part of a flag evaluation, as part of a rule, is a first-class use case. Every single vendor needs to be able to say, here's a rule I'm defining, and based on this attribute coming in for this flag evaluation, I want to differentially render a different result. But because all of the underlying SDKs require that attribute data to be shaped and defined in different ways, there needs to be a way that the provider can say, okay, based on the open feature context which is coming in, I as a provider need to structure this data in a way that my SDK understands.
But in theory, like if this thing didn't exist, then each provider could kind of realize that themselves and kind of do it their own kind of custom way, right? Like it doesn't. I guess what I'm getting to is like this seems like a nice utility to provide to give to someone who's implementing a provider, but it doesn't necessarily need to be part of the spec, right? Because they could use it or not use it, and we wouldn't necessarily need to nail it down, and then kind of like if we need to change it, be like, oh crap, we need to like do a new version of the spec.
Yeah, it provides a structured way to do that. Because of the way some of these providers work with underlying caching mechanisms and things like that, basically state that exists outside of the context of a single flag evaluation, it does make things that would be particularly not performant possible, and it also increases type accuracy within the provider. So yeah, I see your point. We could consider kind of relaxing this or not providing it. and there certainly is no need to do it at all. Like I said, it is optional. You can have a no-op provider, or sorry, a no-op context transformer. But these are all really good points. I mean, there is certainly a risk at over-engineering things early. So it's certainly a consideration. Yes, a great feedback. There's this is already committed to the repo, but if you'd like to open an issue to discuss this further, I definitely encourage that. I think it's a great point.
So one of the considerations though is like, and Todd is actually, and that's I think a discussion point for later, is the difference between context and attributes and what we want to do there. But basically at the end of the day, imagine if we had, you know, a context that was a user ID or a user identifier, and we call it, you know, I don't know, user ID or request ID, whatever we wanted to go with for that. Each backend vendor uses a different value for that. So even like the most basic scenario here, this transformer could just map it to whatever the expected value is. So that was kind of the core use case here. And I think it's kind of required, but how we would define it in the spec, I think could be definitely, you know, open for discussion.
Well, to Pete's point, I mean, the way that problem could be handled would be in every single one of these evaluation methods as an alternative. So instead of exposing a transform context, the provider implementer could, at every single method, do the kind of transformation that we're talking about.
Fair, yeah, okay.
That is true. I think that I think it's a great point whether or not we want to be this prescriptive with how we do context transformation. There is some, like I said, there's some stylistic benefits to defining it, and there's probably some performance benefits to defining it this way. But point taken that we may want to keep things lax. So I think it's a valuable discussion and a valuable thing to consider.
Yeah, I also want to understand a bit more in the future for, like, at least for launch directly, we consider where you can have some attributes private. So like, it sounds like IP address here, maybe like a default value getting passed in, but I don't know if we want that for everyone, you know, because some people don't want that as they consider IP address identifiable information. So we'd want to understand a bit more around how all of that mapping works.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question. And to be less abstract, you can see the implementation that we have for the current launch directly provider, which is very basic. But by default, it maps in all the attributes as custom. That's probably not ideal, but it's because we don't have a well-defined context object for OpenFeature yet. So obviously, you know, there's default attributes here like IP address. This exists in the launch darkly user, right? So we could do something like context.ip were it actually defined in an OpenFeature context object. The thing is, to your point, Dan, is that this is the default context transformer on this provider. So there's a number of ways that users could customize this behavior. They could extend the OpenFeature launch darkly provider. They could, as an option, actually specify their own transformer, which is how the API works now. So you could kind of ignore any of this data. You can override it, or any of this functionality, you can override it. You can hide things. You could, you know, ignore the IP. But in the basic default implementation, you know, right now, because again, we don't have this strong definition for any of these attributes in OpenFeature, we just take the context that's being passed in and throw that all on the launch darkly custom attributes object. I hope that makes some amount of sense.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate the walkthrough on it.
Yeah, and please go ahead and take a look. I mean, this is a very naive implementation just to get the idea across. But I hope it does that. Okay, so I think that's everything I wanted to talk about in terms of the new provider implementations. Last thing, fun demo. Hopefully, so yeah, this is the exciting bit. We have a new demo called install. It's somewhat contrived, but the idea is it's going to render a simple HTML page. I'll show you the markup here. So we have an HTML page and it says, hey, thanks for your interest in our killer app. We see you're using some OS. and please follow the installation instructions. So it's very, very dead simple. But you can understand how maybe if you were a, yeah, I'm using LaunchDarkly for this demo. I think I used CloudBees last time, so I'm trying to spread things around. But we have a feature flag here. You can see installation instructions. The interesting thing about this flag is that it's actually a JSON object. So you can see it's basically fleshing out this template. So, again, if we consider the template I showed you earlier, we see you're using Mac OS, please download our DMG file. We see you're using Windows, please download our exe file to install. That's the basic idea here. So, a non-technical person could come in here and, when some other operating system is supported, they could add, say, an Android entry and then say, please visit the Google App Store. That's relevant because if you take a look at what's actually happening here, we're taking a look at a particular header that most less privacy-oriented browsers, I suppose, is a good way to put it, send along with most requests. So Google Chrome would send this. Firefox, I believe, sends it. There's a few more lockdown browsers that don't send it, but it is a standard. And it's basically a hint for a particular platform that the user is using. So we're sending this along with a request, and we're going to use it to differentially evaluate a feature flag. The thing that's important here, and this kind of demonstrates why context or attributes is important for flag evaluation, you can see we're pulling this out of the request context. We're creating an attribute called platform, and we're sending those attributes along with this flag evaluation request. So I'm going to just run this really quickly. And what you'll see is, thanks for using our killer app. We see you're using Linux. Please install our killer app package using your distributions package manager. And if you look at what actually happened with the request, indeed, you can see we sent along a header indicating that I'm on Linux. It's the header that we lifted. Now, the other interesting things that are happening here, you can see I have a hook. So there's a risk with this setup that a non-technical person could easily come in here and put some really invalid input in this flag value. So I could change this to be a totally invalid object where I've said, okay, the value of the operating system is now 1. That doesn't parse. There's nothing about the underlying flag system that being LaunchDarkly here that understands that's invalid. There's no schema here that we've defined or anything like that. But what you can see we've done here is we've also added into our after hooks, that we've talked about in previous meetings, a very simple validator that leverages some a popular validation library in Node, very similar to JAX-RS validators if you're more familiar with Java. But the idea is we have a simple class we mention, and we attach this. It has some validation annotations. And now when we run this demo again, with the totally invalid data, we can see, oh, the default is fired. We see you're using Windows. Please download our exe. That's the default. And you can see here that some property validation has failed. And that's just because we hooked into the flag evaluation lifecycle. So this is a really basic extensibility concept that I think we've introduced earlier. So we used it for OpenTelemetry integration and for logging. Those are certainly very valid use cases. Here we're using it for some very basic validation. And I think that's a fairly cool use case. So this is definitely one of the more advanced usages of the SDK. You can see we're getting an object back, we're passing in attributes, we're using those attributes to differentially affect the flag value returned, and then we're doing some validation. So this is probably like a full use case for where we're at with the SDK development at this point. And I think that's all I have.
You can ask a question. It's kind of a little bit beside the point, I think, of the demo, but just kind of occurred to me. That attribute that you're grabbing that header and then kind of like figuring out the platform and putting that into an attribute so that when we evaluate the flag, that context is considered. In like a kind of like a more real world scenario, we'd probably want to do that like in some kind of middleware or some kind of like thing so it's always done. What would that look like for the implementer, the person that was doing that, wanting to add
Excellent
that context?
question. Excellent question. That's a fantastic question, and you're absolutely right. So we actually do have I have a branch locally that's using I'm not sure how familiar you are with Node, but there's an API node called asynchronous context tracking.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is probably the recommended way of doing this in Node, and it's equivalent to thread local storage in Java.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can see where I'm getting at here. In the small POC branch I have, exactly what you described. There's a middleware that's throwing arbitrary attributes onto this asynchronous context, and we're pulling it out later.
Yeah, that's the like I started down the path of trying to use the I did a tiny little spike on using the OpenTelemetry thing that does this, and seeing if we could kind of just
baggage.
Yeah, no, not baggage, but
or
like
just the context or something.
Yeah, the OpenTelemetry kind of like thing that uses this, you know, shove something in a span, and then later on it's kind of like available, or at least it's recorded. I wanted to not have to, like, my experience is going down to the level of Node and like getting continuation local storage or async hooks or whatever to work is a huge pain, because you have to support a bunch of different versions of Node, and there's bugs and promises are annoying, and JavaScript's a terrible thing, blah, blah, blah. So I was kind of hoping that we could just grab OpenTelemetry's, it looks like it has a really nice kind of like generic implementation for like, here's how you would do something like thread local storage for a bag of generic context, which is almost exactly what we need. Like I gave up after a while because it was like I couldn't figure out all of the moving parts of how OpenTelemetry does it. But I think it's like, for like my bias is like, as a person using feature flags, this is like the number one kind of like convenience that I want, is to be able to have something at the front of the application or elsewhere shoving a bunch of context into the system, so that I can just, so the application author can just ask questions and not even know like what context is being taken into account. So like, to me, that's like the killer.
Yeah, Todd had a really cool demo of that, and maybe we can push that up so you can kind of play around with it. I've also talked to the OpenTelemetry maintainers about this very thing, and they've readily admitted that it's probably possible, but not really well documented. And we may have to do some clever things because of the way they deal with like the immutability of that context. So I guess active discussions happening there. Another point that's worth mentioning. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying. Awesome.
Oh, cool. The other point that we can, just given the architecture of this, we could actually generate clients per request too. So Todd had another example of using dependency injection, and it's basically a new client would be generated per request. And the reason we can get away with that is because the underlying provider would be the singleton. So that would already like have the flag context, and we wouldn't be regenerating it, which is the expensive part. And then you'd basically associate context with the individual like OpenFeature client. So that could be another alternative too, which is a little bit cleaner in some scenarios.
Yeah, to elaborate on what Mike is saying, it's not just the context, but if you're using a dependency injection framework, it's trivially easy to inject any structure you like into your request handler. So like if you use Nest.js or something like that, those frameworks do allow you to say like, imagine this handler had another parameter here that was like, context or whatever. And it would be injected at the framework level, and then you could inject it at the evaluation level. So that's one way to do it, as well as into the client. But to your point, one of the coolest thing is that even hypothetically, if you're doing this with something along the lines of the async local storage, even flags that don't use that don't openly that you didn't write in third-party libraries, you can inject context into those. So if I'm using an underlying library that I have no control over the flag evaluation code in, but it used OpenFeature, I can inject my context there with 0 interfaces to that library.
Yeah, those
Sounds like-
features, then you can use the provider to kind of customize the library without doing any kind of code yourself.
Exactly. And that's where the async local storage and the thread local storage concepts become really powerful. I totally agree with your, sorry, go ahead.
I just saying we should probably, for the sake of time, kind of move on from this one, but I think it's something that we can maybe, share your experiment and kind of chat about, asynchronously, because it's a super interesting topic, but we have a few other things to get through.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it for me, unless anybody has any questions.
You have one more item on here talking about the context to attributes.
Oh yeah, I guess it's a good segue. So specifically before, because of the reason that context is a fairly overloaded term, it's used natively for something like async local storage in Go. It's in OpenTelemetry. It's obviously a first-class concept with a lot of, I'd say, a lot more power and a lot more surface area than our kind of concept of attributes. I'm kind of proposing that we actually move away from the word context and shift towards attributes. So we can call them flag evaluation attributes or attributes in general. But I'm going to make a PR to the glossary, and feel free to agree or disagree with it or add input, that's going to suggest we move away from the term context and towards attributes or long form flag evaluation attributes. So yeah, I'll open up that PR later today and feel free to weigh in on it. That's it. Thanks, Mike.
And then we have the quick teaser for the spec work. That's your last action item.
Right. Yeah, so I guess that is not really related to the SDK update. I think the theme of the meeting today that we might keep coming back to is we're kind of probably finishing up a lot of our research phase and more moving into a spec phase. So yeah, what we're kind of starting to do, using some pretty cool tooling that was developed from some of the OpenTelemetry folks, is come up with our first crack at an unofficial, at an official spec, be it experimental at this point. So with that, we're really looking for volunteers to write compliant SDKs in various languages. Obviously, Java, Go, .NET, all important targets at this point, and for people to weigh in on the spec as it grows. So more to come on that. Probably we'll mention that more next week and maybe even demo some of the tooling we're using. And I think Justin Abrams, I believe that there was even a thread where you had made some really good observations about how a lot of this might be translated to Java. So that's exactly the kind of input we're hoping to get as we move into more of a spec building phase.
Yeah, I think it'll be reasonable to everyone pick a language that they're familiar with and try to implement at least the client side version of this, the application developer side, make sure it feels right.
Yeah, perfect. And one of the recommendations from the OpenTelemetry side actually was to make the spec open to basically taking advantage of the language itself. So not prescribing anything too specific that makes it like sort of tedious to use in a particular language. So that's just something we'll want to keep in mind as we're defining the spec. Cool. Thanks, Todd. I have just a few quick updates. One is the OTel update. So I've updated Todd's branch actually to take advantage of some of the OTel semantic conventions that we proposed. The two items that became tricky was the concept of a variant, and that becomes important, especially when you're dealing with basically kind of like non-Boolean values, especially around objects. Figuring out what we do, and to Justin's point, really, you're likely not going to want to just dump an object into telemetry data or something. it's not that useful. It'd be better to map that back to like a variant name. That is not a consistent concept across vendors at this point. Even in something like Launch Darkly, which does have it, it actually comes back as an integer, which then we just cast to a string. It's okay, you can figure it out, but it'd be better to have like a friendly name associated with that.
And that also is a point in time, unfortunately, for that, because like if you move the, if you actually change the variation values, you're only looking at that array, so it's not a reliable piece. It's not like a key that's immutable.
Yeah, and I think from like a telemetry perspective, it does make a little bit more sense because you can like start splitting on those values and things like that. So just something to keep in mind as we kind of move forward with that. The other one that was really tricky, in fact, I didn't even really do, was the management URL. So thinking how nice it would be in like an observability tool to see a flag evaluation and be able to click a hyperlink to go back and like see that flag configuration. Almost all SDKs do not provide that. Some you could probably sort of infer it based on the data you have. Others use like GUIDs and stuff. So trying to figure out, of course that's an optional attribute, so it's not something we'd have to provide, but I would definitely encourage vendors to start thinking about how that could work, because I do think that'd be super useful information to provide in the trace. Next step is we're starting to, I think, come to an agreement on that, but maybe take another look at it, see if the most recent proposal makes sense. And if that does, I'm going to go ahead and open a pull request in OpenTelemetry just to get that process rolling. Next item, last time we talked about being able to create your own providers in our experimental branch. I did create a generator now, so it's just a simple like NX generator. You run a single command and it spits out all the scaffolding that you need. So I would encourage you to, if you haven't yet, check out the experimental project and just run the generator, play around with it your own provider, test it out, provide feedback. But it's a really nice way to kind of handle some of the boilerplate stuff for you. Next item was a cloud native implementation. That was something we had talked about. I still think it's kind of an open item. It's something we're going to want to probably continue to chat about, like our messaging around that. To some extent, I think it's a pretty important concept because I think as more and more people move to more cloud native environments, offloading flag evaluation to either a service or a dedicated process may make more sense architecturally. And so I think it's something we'd want to keep track of in the spec potentially, but how that breaks down is still definitely open to discussion. And as part of that, we've started to consider what it would take to do a proof of concept, ideally to have some kind of demo ready by KubeCon EU. So if you have any interest in being involved in that, certainly let me know. But that's something we're going to try to pull something together just to kind of get a sense of does the architecture work, where kind of the gaps, and give us something to work off of. So that's something that's kind of under active development right now. And then lastly, related to KubeCon, I know a few of us will be there. If you're going to, if you are going to be there, I created a Google form, so please fill out some information there, and we'll try to schedule some time to meet up. And Eloise volunteered to pay for some t-shirts, so put your t-shirt size in there too, and we'll get those printed and handed out. So that's it for me. It looks like that's it for the agenda. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but yeah, please feel free.
Yeah, maybe just one more item. Last time we discussed about like having like a PR or blog announcements or whatever it's eventually going to turn out to be. We talked to our internal teams and we should have something available for you by next week. So we will post a link to the document out by next week. Again, usual approach, like there's some shared text in the beginning and then you can put in whatever like you want, what best fits you. And obviously, if there's anything in there that you don't like, yeah, then just say that you don't like it, basically. And obviously think about like a quote. So we will have different quotes available that people can use as part of the like PR and other topics as well. So think of who could be a good person to have a quote, or if you want to do one yourself, that people can use, that we can throw them in. But again, more next week. So there's a lot of Easter holidays going on right now over here. That will end by next week, Tuesday. So that's what I'm expecting it to happen next week.
Perfect. Thanks, Eloise. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have just one more thing. Didn't we like 2 meetings ago, didn't like Justin offer to talk about what they actually built at eBay and we never got back to him? I wasn't sure whether we deliberately didn't do it because Justin wanted to take more time or we just forgot about it.
Yeah, sure, but I can spend 4 minutes and talk to you about what we're making.
Yeah, if you don't mind, unless someone
sure,
else has
yeah.
something.
So we're building feature flags internally to eBay. After some vendor analysis, the big sticking point for us was we have an already home built experimentation engine, and we couldn't figure out how to get external vendors to work in a good developer experience as you migrate from feature flag to experiment. So we're building audience aware feature flags with a kind of using the stuff that's available in the industry as a guide. We're trying to track the spec. We're not entirely sure where along our roadmap we're going to get it. Like when the spec stabilizes enough that we can like start writing against it. But we're trying to like borrow some ideas from it and map our API to that API, even though it's a moving target. We are just now testing our first customers internally and getting feedback. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Oh, it currently works in by making API calls for all flag evaluations, which is probably not something that will survive for eternity. We probably will move to a local rule set that gets evaluated mechanism. But that's where we're at today.
That's not actually entirely unusual. Well, it's not entirely unheard of. It's less common. It's a less common pattern, and there's obvious limitations to it. But it is how the version 1 of the Flagsmith SDK does work as well. You can set up some caching to obviously reduce the traffic, but conceptually that's what's happening. So it was these kinds of different implementation details are why it's fun to attempt to abstract this in a consistent way across all different providers.
Yeah, I think we should get Alex back to that conversation at some point because he had that proposal of implementing, especially the rule evaluation piece within WebAssembly, which would lend itself very nicely to being part of the SDKs because you could load it language independent and evaluate at nearly native speed and even update at runtime. So I think that might like be a really nice approach because you only need to export pretty much the interface, like evaluate this for me. And you can take your entire rule set, compile it down to WebAssembly and send it down and evaluate it locally for scenarios where you can do it. So maybe we can get him to talk about this, like how I thought that was working. And yeah, some people here know that I'm currently very much fascinated by what you can do with WebAssembly because I'm using it for some use cases, but I thought the idea is kind of intriguing because building like an evaluation engine in multiple languages sounds like havoc to happen at some point, because at some point you will get at least one of the implementations not being compliant simply because that's what we do. We write code as good as we do, but sometimes we don't get it like 100% right. So that might be also an interesting one that gets sent down. But what I found very interesting from you, Justin, and maybe we could put this in some points into the docs, the difference between like the feature flag and experimentation. I think it separates also like what the backends are doing, because if I understood it correctly, like feature flag is the flag, like the thing that you can turn on and off. And experimentation is pretty much the rules that you apply when you turn something on and off, right?
So in our version of the world, experimentation is statistical analysis based on some end state that we hope for. And so being at eBay, you can imagine there's like, hey, when we flip this flag, does money go up or does money go down? And that experiment like tracks statistical significance and things like that around how did the money work? And there's like a bunch of like tracking stuff that happens to fuel that, and that's all internal systems.
Yeah,
and so-
whereas the feature flag is basically the pivot point in the code that is the basis for information input into the experiment, and the pivot point in the code could be an arbitrary split based on a percentage or based on attributes or just a Boolean or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and right now we have different. The current state of the world is if you want to move to experimentation, you actually have to like replace all your code to do experiments. We're trying to make the experimentation SDK API compatible with the feature flagging SDK because they're actually two different sets of code, so that developers don't have to change stuff.
Would the end goal be the developer, like the application author, doesn't really know or care whether they're writing code for like a release toggle, like, you know, a dark launch versus a A/B test? They're just implementing.
Hopefully that becomes more of a product manager decision.
Yeah.
As to like how we ramp our code. And the important part for developers is like, it's live, I can see it. That does in fact work.
I guess an interesting test of the spec that we have is whether you could get people internally comfortable with using that hook concept to track analytics for an A/B test, not just like OpenTelemetry, but like, because that's the thing I see most. That's the biggest split, if you'll pardon the pun, between like feature flagging, traditional feature flagging, and like experimentation is like how much do we care about like where the experience data goes and like tracking who saw what experience. And I've seen Launch Darkly trying to get into the experimentation space. I've seen Optimizely trying to get into the feature flagging space, and the big difference is that experience part, or tracking who saw what experience.
Yeah, in the eBay world, a lot of that tracking happens outside of the purview of developers. It's like, I called this API and magic happened, and now there's a tracking event somewhere in some other system that says like the header that came from the upstream request had this user ID, and now that's in that thing. And
yeah,
a lot of like black box from my perspective. And that has pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt here. We're just about out of time. I think this might be a good conversation to pick up next time. So if you don't mind putting that on the agenda, it's really interesting. I think it does lead to some interesting questions here. But yeah, if there's nothing else, I think we can go ahead and wrap up just so we make sure everyone can probably make your next meeting on time. So yeah, any last thoughts? Perfect. All right. Thanks for your time, everyone. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye everyone.